Alright, so I'm here to talk about the inclusion, or actually lack thereof, of a Comic-Con panel devoted to The Hobbit Part 2, or The Hobbit Desolation of Smaug. And yeah, if I recall correctly, Peter Jackson did have a Comic-Con panel for The Hobbit Part 1, but not for Part 2, and he gave a variety of reasons. I mean, basically he has a bit too much on his palette to put together a Comic-Con panel for people to see. I mean, he's working on, I think the stuff he said he was working on, he's working on the extended cut of The Hobbit Part 1, which I think should be available October or November, somewhere around there. So he's working on the extended cut of that, because the Lord of the Rings movies got an extended cut. What else? He's working on, and he's also working on basically post-production stuff and pickups for The Hobbit Part 2 and 3. So he's basically at the point where he's done the principal photography. He's basically, I think, done with most, if not all, of the actors. So he's basically just fine-tuning everything. I mean, he's putting the finishing touches on some stuff, and working out the final designs for some of the stuff that's going to go in later via computer. So, little disheartened that there was no Comic-Con panel devoted to this, because this is the movie that's probably, more than any other movie this year, I'm looking forward to. I mean, I was looking forward to Part 1, and mainly because The Lord of the Rings, without thinking too hard, they might be my favorite live-action movie series. They might be some of my favorite live-action movies of all time. I mean, my favorite movie of all time is Lion King, but Lord of the Rings is up there. So naturally, when I heard that there was going to be a prequel to Lord of the Rings, based off The Hobbit, I was psyched. And then I heard it was being split into first two and then 3 movies. So then I was just kind of, because this puts me in kind of a precarious position in terms of what I say in relation to, basically what I say about The Hobbit in relation to what I say about other movies. Because really, I'm not a fan of splitting these. Generally, I'm not a fan of splitting movies up into multiple movies. I mean, they've been doing that, and they're continuing to do that. They did that with Harry Potter 7. Harry Potter 7 did not need to be 2 movies, especially considering how boring Part 1 was. I mean, you could have had just a 3-hour-long Harry Potter movie, and just skipped the very boring Part 1, and then later you could go back and give us an extended cut of that. But again, they did it with Twilight, same problem, except to a whole new extreme, where literally the first part was almost all padding. And yes, I have seen the Twilight movies. None of them are good, but probably without thinking too hard, Part 1 of Breaking Dawn might be the worst. Just because of I could not keep interest during that movie, because it's just nothing happens. There are long stretches of that movie where nothing happens. And it all could have been resolved if they had just not split the final book into 2 parts. Again, I didn't read the book, but just going by the movies, it didn't need to be 2 movies. They could have squeezed that into a 2.5-hour movie max. I mean, even Part 2 had some padding, especially around the beginning, especially in the first act. But with regards to The Hobbit being split into 3 movies. Basically, what makes that an interesting move is that the Hobbit book is a comparatively shorter novel than any of the Lord of the Rings movies or Lord of the Rings books. So if you're taking it on that, like each of the Lord of the Rings movies got 1 movie. Granted, each of them got a 3-hour long movie, 4 hours if you count the extended cut. And The Hobbit is getting 3 movies that are, as far as I know, at least the first one was almost 3 hours. If they're all going to be 3 hours long, then there might be some problems. And some of those problems started to show up in An Unexpected Journey, and I did like that movie. But there was a lot of stuff in that movie that was thrown in from the books as basically a love letter to fans of Tolkien's works. It was basically fan service was a large part of Part 1. I mean, partially fan service and partially because they are trying to introduce all these other subplots that will most likely come to fruition in later parts, like the Sauron subplot with the Necromancer. That is never resolved in Part 1, and as a self-contained movie, it really does not need to be in there. But again, it leads up to something in Part 2 and 3. The whole thing with Radagast, if you were just going to make The Hobbit Part 1 a completely self-contained medium that would work well as a movie by itself, I would cut out Radagast. I would cut out about half the stuff with the dwarves and their shenanigans. I would cut out. I don't know if I would cut out Azog. I probably wouldn't cut out Azog, but I would trim the dinner. I would trim several scenes of. I would trim the stone giants, because that basically amounted to little, if anything. It was just an effect sequence. Again, it's taking something from the book. It's taking a creature from the book, but and I kind of knew it was coming because it was in all the trailers. But again, it didn't really add anything to the central story. But on the other hand, splitting The Hobbit into 3 movies really pleases the inner fanboy in me. This is just me talking from a very selfish perspective, where I really like this stuff. I really like the kind of fantasy genre. And basically, these Hobbit movies look like they're going to delve deeper into the source material and bring out characters and concepts and that basically they could not get away with in The Lord of the Rings, because The Lord of the Rings was, I don't want to say isolated, but it largely took place in the kingdoms of men. I mean, a lot like Rohan and Gondor. So you couldn't really get a feel for all these other different cultures in Middle-earth, like the dwarves, the elves, etc. Like, you didn't really see any dwarf kingdoms except for Moria. I mean, you didn't really see any elf kingdoms except for Rivendell. And you didn't really see any characters that were not completely essential to the story. Yeah. Part of me really wants them to go all out with this and give us more. I mean, the inner fanboy in me is screaming, yes, 3 movies, more. But the critic in me is saying this could have easily been done in 1. I mean, it's it's really hard to say because there are these two different sides of me that each have kind of opposing views on the fundamental way that they are approaching this Hobbit movie, or these Hobbit movies. Again, the logical critic in me is saying this could have easily been done in one 3-hour movie. Sure, they would have to condense the story, and you wouldn't have as much time to get to know these dwarf characters, but all these other dwarf characters weren't really a huge part of the book, aside from just being there. You didn't have to include all these extra characters. It could have just been done as a straightforward prequel movie. One prequel movie. But again, the inner geek, the inner fanboy in me is saying, bring it on. Bring on these 3 really long movies so I can get immersed in this fantasy world for as long as possible. Keep bringing us new content. I mean, as long as it's not a betrayal of Tolkien's vision, or as long as it's not a betrayal of anything that was in the Lord of the Rings, the inner fanboy in me will stay satisfied. He will stay happy. I sound really kind of disturbed, but I was looking at the trailers, because a trailer for The Hobbit debuted, I think, in front of Man of Steel, and basically it looks like a lot of the same problems that I don't want to trying to decide problems or gripes. In that, well, one major gripe that I had about Unexpected Journey that looks like it's going to carry over into the other movies is that there's too much CG. There's too much CGI. I mean, the majority of the orcs are CGI, or were CGI, and will continue to be CGI. Like Azog was, I know he was motion capture, but he was obviously he was not as well realized as Gollum. I mean, he still looked very convincing. But again, you look at the orcs in the Lord of the Rings movies, they are actually there. I mean, you can tell that they are guys who are working their butts off in these prosthetic suits and this heavy armor, and you just when a hero hits them with their sword or hits them with their axe or shoots an arrow at them, basically all of the combat had real impact in the Lord of the Rings movies. Something that was sorely missing from The Hobbit, and I think the fact that most of the orcs and monsters in The Hobbit were CG, I think that has something to do with it. I mean, you can just tell there's just something about it. It just lacks that punch that you get when a character is hitting something real. I mean, it's, again, very impressive accomplishment in terms of CGI, and it's not that it looks fake. I mean, it looks very, very good. I mean, this is some of the greatest attention to detail we've gotten in CGI in years. I mean, this is just great CGI, but again, a lot of the times I didn't really think it was necessary. I mean, the goblins, we've had goblins in these movies before. We had the goblins in Moria, in Fellowship of the Ring. But for some reason they gave them all these kind of cartoonish, exaggerated, gross-out features in The Hobbit, like these bulging eyes and a lot of skin conditions. Maybe the fact that their designs were so exaggerated compared to the original Lord of the Rings goblins. Maybe the reason for that is because The Hobbit is a more light-hearted story than Lord of the Rings. And that basically appropriately carried through the movie. It carried through to the movie because The Hobbit, the first part anyway, was a comparatively lighter movie than any of the Lord of the Rings movies. I mean, you had this merry band of dwarves, and they were gonna go on this quest to slay a dragon. There was certainly a lot more fantasy aspects to the story. I mean, you had the talking trolls, you had Gandalf using his magic more than he did in Lord of the Rings. I mean, you had, and there was I've heard the term swashbuckling used, and there was certainly a certain swashbuckling, high-flying adventure quality to a lot of the fight scenes, especially with the when they were escaping from Goblin Town. So that I liked, but getting back to the trailer, I mean, Azog is back, but again, Manu Bennett, you can't see him under all that CGI. I mean, you can see his facial movements, but you can't see him, and I think you should. I don't know. I mean, Gollum does the same thing, but for Gollum, I understand. He's skin and bone, basically. I mean, Gollum, I understand, but for Manu Bennett, you could easily have just put him in the same type of orc mask and orc armor that a lot of the stunt guys in Lord of the Rings had to wear. But again, getting off track. As far as the characters in the movie go, you're getting more of Lee Pace as the Elven King, Thranduil. You're getting Orlando Bloom back, but there's this really, for all the compliments I gave the CGI in these movies, there's this one shot in the trailer where Orlando Bloom first shows up. He's sliding across the screen at the same time notching an arrow and pointing it at Thorin. And there's a cut to where, like, he's sliding, he gets up next to Thorin, and then it cuts to a close-up of Orlando Bloom. But when you see him sliding, that's not actually Orlando Bloom sliding towards Thorin. That's a really fake-looking CGI Legolas right there. It just lacks texture. A lot of the elves seem to lack texture, at least in the trailer. I mean, maybe they need to fine-tune the effects more. I mean, maybe the trailer was just kind of rushed out. But yeah, the elves actually look really, really laughable, at least in the trailer. I mean, they lack texture. They don't really seem. A lot of their movements don't really seem human, and I understand elves are not human, but it just looks really kind of cartoonish, especially with them kind of jumping through the branches and firing arrows and doing somersaults and spinning around. So I don't know. Maybe the effects will be better when the movie actually releases. But one has to wonder: is that really the effect that they're going with? I don't know. But as for the rest of the characters, you get Radagast back. You get, who else is back? All the dwarves are back. It looks like. I mean, if Thorin is back, that was one thing I really had to admire about The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey, Part 1, is that they really gave Thorin this really tragic and interesting backstory, something that was sorely missing from the original story, which I have in my bookshelf. I'm kind of glancing back at that, but yeah, they gave Thorin this really cool backstory, that really added a lot of depth to an otherwise one-note character, or a character that could have easily just been one note. And if the character had been one note, these movies wouldn't have worked, because he is essentially filling in for Viggo Mortensen in The Lord of the Rings. Granted, Viggo Mortensen was better as Aragorn, at least I think so, but yeah, Thorin's back. It looks like they're gonna combat the spiders in Mirkwood Forest, and that's presumably when Bilbo will name his sword. Again, they changed some stuff in Lord of the Rings in terms of naming weapons, like like with Aragorn's sword. So I don't know that. It would make sense for Bilbo to name his sword after he defeats the spiders. But you have what is it? Lee? No, I'm blanking on his name. The guy from Three Musketeers. I just had it. But the guy from Three Musketeers, the really young-looking guy, almost Orlando Bloom-looking guy. He looks like what would happen if James Purefoy and Orlando Bloom kind of meshed together. The guy playing Bard. I'm gonna kill myself when I finally look up his name, because I just had it a second ago. But the guy playing Bard, I actually think is a little too young. To be honest, I mean when I pictured Bard in the book, I pictured this kind of chiseled, grizzled, not really middle-aged, but kind of guy in his 40s who basically how he looked in the 1970s cartoon, in the Rankin Bass movie. I mean, I pictured him looking like that, not the outfit. I mean, obviously he would have to have a more practical outfit than the whole caveman thing they had him sporting in that movie. But yeah, I think the casting on Bard is a little too young, but he may impress me. I don't know, because Richard Armitage, I hope that's how you pronounce his name. He impressed me when he played Thorin, at least in part 1, because when I first heard he was going to play Thorin, I'm like, really? I mean, you couldn't go with someone a little older like Ian McShane, balin. I mean, all the other dwarf actors fit their roles very well, especially Ken Stote as Balin. But Richard Armitage, really? I mean, he seems, I don't know, when you look at him, you don't really think, oh, he can play a dwarf. I mean, you could picture him playing one of the men in Middle Earth, but a dwarf? I don't know. But he did really well. I mean, he looks, I hope they gave him more to say than he had in part 1, at least towards Martin Freeman, because he was really kind of, he really had this kind of hostility and animosity towards Bilbo in the first part, and they've kind of established that they've moved past that at the end of the first movie. So hopefully we'll get to see some more interactions between them, see how their relationship develops, and finally you actually no, not yet. What the hell? So finally, the shot that has everyone freaking out. Anyone who watches the trailer for Desolation of Smaug literally flip. Anyone who watches this flips when they see the dragon, because this dragon is huge. I mean, it's a CGI dragon, obviously, but you don't actually hear him talk. You don't hear Benedict Cumberbatch in the trailer, which is sad, but you see the dragon. You see the dragon looking at Bilbo, kind of creeping out behind this ruined column that Bilbo was hiding behind, and it's basically a reveal that this is the size of opponent that this company is facing. So this company of dwarves and a wizard and a hobbit, that is the enemy that they're facing. He looks really good. I mean, he looks different than the other Smaugs we've seen over the years. I mean, he looks different than the kind of cat-like Smaug, or like the saber-toothed cat type Smaug that was in the Rankin Bass movie, and he looks different than the kind of more reptilian iguana-looking Smaug from the Hobbit video game. So this looks really good. This creature, this character, because he is essentially a character. He does talk. He looks really, really menacing. I mean, he just his size alone. I mean, just the sound design. The audio department really captured the scope of this thing at the end of part one, where you see his eye, and you see him kind of turning in his sleep under all the gold. So they really have done a good job capturing the size and just the mass of this creature. And from the looks of the trailer, they have not lost their touch. I mean, he looks great. So I don't know why his eyes are glowing, but I can live with that. And yeah, that's about all I have to say on The Hobbit. Part 2, The Desolation of Smaug. I wonder if it'll be as good of a part 2 as The Two Towers. Because The Two Towers, as far as middle chapters go, was really good. I mean, I'm not even speaking from a fanboy's perspective. I'm just saying they did a very good job establishing The Two Towers as a fairly self-contained medium, and a very dramatic self-contained medium. I mean, it's really up in the air. The effects, I think, are up in the air at this point. I mean, hopefully they improve on some of the effects, because the effects for some of these creatures, specifically the elves, really look kind of cheap. I mean, not cheap, but cheap by Weta Digital standards and ILM standards, and basically cheap by the standards of these really talented visual effects artists. Yeah, aside from that, the dragon looks good, and actually a lot of the locations look really atmospheric and really cool. I mean, Lake Town, they kind of give this Venice, Italy aesthetic to it. Not really in terms of the color palette, but in terms of the architectural design. I mean, there are boats sailing through the there are boats going through the waterways between the buildings. I mean, it really looks like this kind of Italian architectural design, at least at ground level. I mean, I don't know if the buildings will be any different. I mean, the buildings, I mean, they've only shown kind of flashes of the buildings in the trailer, so I can't really speak too much for the building. But Stephen Fry as the mayor of Lake Town, or the head of Lake Town, it's Stephen Fry, so hopefully he'll be funny. What little we've seen of Erebor, both in part 1 and in the trailers for part 2, it looks fairly vast. I mean, appropriately enough, it looks similar in design to the Mines of Moria, because they're both built by dwarves. But I'll be interested to see how it's changed in terms of its appearance in the I think 60 years. I think they said in the first movie. I'm going by the movies here, but in the 60 years since the dwarves were forced to vacate the premises, I'm curious to see how it's changed. I mean, is it going to be like in Fellowship of the Ring, where you see all these kind of dwarf corpses lying around? Or are you going to see broken walls? Is it going to be real ruined? I mean, basically the main hall, the throne room that you see them walking through in the trailer, it looks basically the same. I mean, there might be a few cracks or breaks in design that I'm missing, but it looks every bit as visually stunning as the first part. I mean, that's one thing I can say about the first part. It looked gorgeous. A lot of Peter Jackson's films do. I mean, even the bad ones, like a lot of people gave flack to Lovely Bones for not being a very good movie in itself, but even the people who did not like it praised how it looked and how it was shot. So So Peter Jackson really has an eye for very beautiful movies. So it doesn't really look like that's changed. One thing I am kind of concerned about, though, is the actors have said that the film will probably be darker. By darker, I hope they don't mean like Lord of the Rings darker, because by its very nature, The Hobbit is a lighter, kind of friendlier story than The Lord of the Rings. I mean, yeah, there is some dark stuff in there, particularly with Smaug and a lot of the perilous encounters, but it was never really dark. I mean, it was kind of an earnest adventure flick, or it was kind of an earnest adventure story with all these fantastical creatures in it. I mean, I don't really think a film adaptation calls for a dark tone. So I don't know. Maybe it'll just be a little bit darker, like how Chronicles of Narnia Prince Caspian was darker than The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Again, going strictly by the movies. The second movie in the Narnia series was just a bit darker than the first movie, but again, you could still tell that it was from the same. It was cut from the same cloth, as it were. I mean, it's not like the Harry Potter movies where you watch Sorcerer's Stone and then you watch one of the later movies, and you almost would not be able to tell that it's from the same series because there's just such a vast tonal difference. So, again, I hope it's not too tremendously. I keep using this word, but I hope it's not too tremendously dark, because then it just becomes The Lord of the Rings, and that's not what The Hobbit is. I'm sorry, but it takes place in the same world, but The Hobbit is it's a kid's story. I mean, it's a family story. Yeah, it has violence in it, but it's a family story, and I hope they don't forget that. But aside from that little bit of cautious thinking, I am still very excited. I mean, the trailer, just in terms of what was in it. I mean, I'm not talking about the effects, but just in terms of the locales and the story and basically the whole adventure aspect. I mean, it looks fantastic. I mean, it looks like they're finally. I mean, it looks like they're done with the primary stages of their journey, obviously. I mean, but we really get to see some more exciting swashbuckling type stuff. So yeah, I got high hopes, and I hope I'm not. It sounds kind of selfish, but I hope I'm not disappointed. I hope it is not a disappointment to anyone. I mean, that's too much to ask. I hope it doesn't suck. Yeah, that's the term I'm looking for. That is the phrase I'm looking for. I hope it does not suck, because then I might know how a lot of people felt after The Phantom Menace. Or actually how I felt recently after Man of Steel. No, I'm never gonna let that go. So yeah, I'm not gonna give my opinion on The Phantom Menace. Forget it. This video is already too long. Hobbit, hope it's good. I know I've said it a lot, but I really mean it. Don't screw this up, Peter Jackson.